All right. So where we had left off yesterday, we were looking at kind of the couple of years prior to Jackson's election, where we start to see a new shift taking place in the development of some new political parties. That happens. The division had really already been there with different factions, different groups within the Republican Party, but it started to become more pronounced as a result of that election of 1824. We talked yesterday very quickly about how that election ended up disputed and ended up in Congress to decide, and who were the two main candidates for that Congress was deciding between. Good. So it came down to between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson being the leader in the popular vote, but the electoral vote was disputed of exactly who had won that one, and who did Congress declare the winner. They declared John Quincy Adams the winner. So what did Jackson's people start calling the election? Yes, corrupt bargain. Calling it the corrupt bargain of 24 instead of the election of 1824, suggesting that something underhanded had gone on, that it was rigged, that a deal had been made between the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams, that he would make him Secretary of State, because when John Quincy Adams becomes president, Henry Clay does become his Secretary of State. We have absolutely no evidence to prove that that's what happened, but it did seem a little suspicious to all of Jackson's supporters that cry foul and get very angry about it and are not happy for the next 4 years. So Jackson's side, they start calling themselves what? Democratic Republicans, trying to invoke the memory of Jefferson and all of that, whereas Adams's people start becoming known as National Republicans. So we have Democratic Republicans and National Republicans, both of them, claiming to be Republican, but kind of claiming some different specifics about that. But that's kind of a mouthful to say. So eventually, instead of Democratic Republicans and National Republicans, it becomes Democrats, Whigs, Democrats and Whigs. So your two major political parties are going to be, for the next little bit here, Democrats and Whigs. The Whigs, formerly known as National Republicans, are going to be those that support, of course, more national power, stronger federal government, much more reminiscent of your old Federalists, whereas your Democrats are going to generally prefer smaller government, sometimes, more power to the people, at least use that message. And Jackson would definitely consider himself the heir apparent of Jefferson, the next president that really seems to, support the people and be a reflection of the people, the regular folks, the average guy. Jackson is very different in that sense. So, fast forwarding now to 4 years later. So 4 years later, we would have the election of 1828, a rematch this time between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So this time it's the two of them. So John Quincy Adams is running for re-election, and Andrew Jackson is running against him. The election of 1828 is significant for a couple of reasons, or it's characterized by a couple of things that were different and unusual for this time period. One of those is this was what we call a mudslinging election. This will not be an unfamiliar concept to us because this is all we see and hear. But in this day and age, this was kind of a new thing, and it was very different and maybe a bit upsetting to some people. We talk about people mudslinging. That doesn't literally mean they're throwing, mud around each other. What does that mean? Trying to make each other look bad, talking bad about each other, saying ugly things about each other, making personal attacks on each other. Again, not a new concept to us. It seems like these days political candidates don't really talk too much about themselves. They talk about each other. But going after your opponent, particularly not even just talking bad about them, but attacking their personality, attacking their character, attacking their background, their family, those kind of things, that was just sort of not done in this time. So both Adams and Jackson are doing that in this election and spending more time talking bad about each other, making attacks on their character, making attacks on their personality, as opposed to criticizing their politics. And the main reason, one of the reasons for that was there really wasn't a huge difference in their politics. They kind of were very similar on a lot of the policies that they supported, or at least the differences were not so great. They felt they could make a big campaign issue about it. However, their backgrounds were incredibly different. And so both Jackson and Adams resort to this mudslinging, attacking each other, more on the basis of personality and background and all that, personal life even, which at the time just simply wasn't done. So that was kind of a new thing, and for some people, quite a disturbing thing. As far as the stuff they said about each other, Jackson accuses Adams of being an elitist. What does that mean if he's calling him an elitist? He only cares about the rich. He is someone that is out of touch with the people. He only understands and only cares for and only represents the upper class. He uses Adams's background against him, trying to portray him as this super privileged, completely out of touch with the regular person individual. And to some extent, Adams was an easy target in that case. He's from New England. He's not the most wealthiest of people, but he does come from, quite the political family. His father was president. Adams had, very fine education. He traveled to Europe. Most people could not have said that at that time. So he was kind of an easy target in that sense. And being the big nationalist that he was, it was easy to accuse him of wanting too much national power and wanting this super powerful federal government that was just going to stomp all over the freedoms of the people, and he was wasteful and all these sorts of things. Jackson is accused of lots of things as well. Adams calls Jackson multiple names, but he calls him a barbarian for one thing. What's he saying about him if he calls him a barbarian?
There's no education.
No education, which Jackson really didn't, which was true. What else might you be saying about someone if you call him a barbarian?
He might be rude or his actions are bad.
Rude, crude, just uncivilized, unfit to be president, just a complete and total kind of a, backwoods wild man. And that's kind of fit Jackson's description a little bit. There he's trying to use Jackson's background against him, but that brings up some important things about Jackson's background. Jackson is unlike any presidential candidate there had ever been, unlike any president there had ever been. Jackson was because obviously he's going to win this election, becomes president. Jackson was the first president that was born into poverty, that was not born into wealth. He's the first one that did not come from a wealthy upbringing, a prestigious family. He didn't have a formal education the way that every president before him had. Don't get me wrong, he was a wealthy man by the time he was elected, but he was not born into that. He was kind of the first one that could really argue he was a self-made man, that he was someone that had, through his own, accomplishments, worked himself up to that point, that he was not born into those things the way that other presidents had been. But Adams portrays him as just, this is the end of the country as we know it. If someone like this guy, who's completely unqualified and, will just destroy everything, then the whole country is going to fall apart. He also accuses Jackson of being an adulterer. Calls him an adulterer, I know. What is he accusing him of there? Yeah, accusing him of not being faithful. The story behind that, when this is the one that, Jackson could take a lot of criticism, but this is the one that made him mad. The allegation behind it was that that his wife, that his wife was not legally or officially divorced from her first husband when she married Jackson. And there was some kind of technicality, and the divorce wasn't legal or something like that. So they accuse him of his marriage as being adulterous. What? True, but they would accuse Jackson nonetheless. That, call him a bigamist. That he was, yeah. Well, I guess that's the ultimate question, isn't it? And in these days, it typically didn't. These days this was quite unusual. And this was really more of a technicality thing than anything else. But there are plenty of presidents well into the 20th century that had multiple affairs and things like that, and that were quite promiscuous. But it was not. It's really a later half of the 20th century thing for that kind of stuff to be talked about and used against someone. I suppose you can say that, yeah. But those are the kind of things that, were going around. It wasn't just he's going to do this and he's going to do that and he believes this sort of thing, but just he's completely and entirely unfit to be president. And Jackson in particular did not the stuff about being an adulterer, all that kind of thing, didn't sit well with him. It particularly affected his wife. In fact, she died right after he was elected, and he always blamed those people that said things about her for causing her stress that resulted in her death. She died of a heart attack. So he never forgave Adams, never forgave a lot of people for that. However, after all of that, of course, who wins the election? Jackson does, and he does in quite a landslide. Another important thing about the election of 1828 is you have more people voting in this election than had ever voted before. The largest number of people participating in the election, and not just because of population growth or anything like that. That was part of it. But the real reason for that was that by 1828, there were more people that had the right to vote, because a lot of states, most states by this point, were starting to drop the property requirement to vote. What does that mean if they were dropping the property requirement to vote? And if they're dropping that, they're saying that you don't. Right, leading up to this, we talked about before, the only people that had the right to vote were, of course, men, white men, but also property-owning white men. So the electorate was rather a small percentage of the population. By 1828, most states were starting to eliminate that property requirement and allowing men and still white men, but allowing certainly more people to vote. Those people that are new voters that are just now getting that right to vote, non-property owners, do you think they were more likely to identify with someone like Jackson or more likely to identify with someone like Adams? Certainly Jackson. They saw Jackson as more a manifestation of themselves. And so those people overwhelmingly support Jackson. And that's one of the ways that he wins in 1828 is he gets such a strong support for those newer voters that were, more poor and rural and farmers and all those sorts of things. So Jackson's election kind of signifies a completely new, kind of a new day, a new age for American democracy, a big thing that is shifting. As I mentioned yesterday, Jackson is one of those presidents that gets kind of, a whole era named for them, a whole concept carries his name. So this ushers in this age of Jackson, or this Jacksonian era, or what is known as Jacksonian democracy. Jacksonian democracy refers to lots of things. But when we think of Jacksonian democracy, a good way to characterize it, think of it as an expansion of democracy. That under Jacksonian democracy, we are seeing an expansion of democracy. What does that mean if something is expanding? It's growing, it's getting bigger, it's including more people. Jacksonian democracy, we are seeing more of what oftentimes is known as a common man democracy. A democracy that is becoming more inclusive, that the political system was changing by this point to be more inclusive, to be more open, to involve more people. Now, we have to realize, of course, that is still incredibly limited, certainly by our standards. But it was changing. It was definitely a change, and it was, in some people's eyes, quite the revolutionary thing. So some examples of that, one we just mentioned. What was a way that democracy was expanding that we just mentioned? Yeah, more voters. The fact that you've got more voters is a part of that more people are allowed to vote by this time than have ever voted before. So the new voters are a part of that Jacksonian democracy, and people that did not have that right, that didn't have the ability to make choices that were not included in that democratic process now are. And you're also including not just more people, but you're including more common people. You are including poorer people. You are including people that are not necessarily, part of that elite class and so forth. Another example of Jacksonian democracy, of course, is Jackson himself. Jackson himself embodies those principles of a common man democracy and certainly labels himself as a common man president. So what is Jackson trying to say about himself and his supporters saying about him by calling him the common man president? Yes. Like everybody else. And what kind of things did we say Jackson has in his background that could make him say that? Yeah, he wasn't born wealthy. He does not have a formal education. He did not grow up in prestige and all those kind of things. He was born into poverty. He was an orphan by the time he was a teenager, so he did not have those kind of, certain privileges in life, and kind of had to work more for what he had through the military and those kinds of things. Kind of a self-made sort of person. Once again, he's a very rich man by the time he becomes president. He's a plantation owner. He's from Tennessee. Owns slaves, all those sorts of things. And he's also from, another thing is, as well as being poor, born poor and all that, he's also the first one that is from what at the time would have been considered a Western state, or at least at the time in which he was born, from the Tennessee area. Every president before him had either been from Virginia or, in the case of the Adamses, from Massachusetts. So there had been this, sense that all presidents came from those earlier states and things like that, but he's more of a frontier kind of a guy, or at least was originally. So that is a part of it. We already mentioned the expanded voting rights, so that one we've already talked about, but that's another example of Jacksonian democracy in a way that it was including more people, is that more people have the ability to vote. Once again, it is still limited. Another example of Jacksonian democracy, a way that Jackson at least would argue was making the system more open, more democratic, more inclusive, and involving the people more. Although you can also see there's another side to this that would make it doesn't sound very democratic at all. But the regular use of something called the spoil system. So associate Jackson with this use of the spoil system. He doesn't invent it. This had actually already been around, but Jackson uses it heavily, and he uses it in a certain way. The spoil system is this practice of appointing people to political jobs as a reward for their support. So appointing people to government jobs, appointing people to government positions as a reward for their support for you. So someone has supported you, they have campaigned for you, they have always been there for you, defending you, all those kind of things, they've worked for you. So when you become president, you appoint that person to a government position, heading some agency or some other kind of job. You're going to make them the postmaster of this, all kinds of things. And doing that kind of to reward them for their loyalty. So the concept of the president appointing people to jobs, of course, that's not new, that's always in there. Jackson is the first one to do it very heavily, to come in and just completely claim house and, get rid of people that had been in some government positions perhaps for decades and put in the people that he wanted. And he's also the first one to really kind of use it as a reward loyalty system, to kind of use it as a means of rewarding people for their loyalty. Now, obviously, you can see how there's plenty of room there for corruption and to give people jobs that don't deserve them. And yes, that absolutely happens, and that becomes something we'll talk about next year, late 19th century. You'll see attempts to reform this and put in safeguards so that doesn't happen, and to cut down on that corruption. But Jackson, so that part of it we'll look at later. Jackson will argue that this is more democratic because it means, for one thing, that there's more rotation. Another phrase that is used to describe this is rotation in office. So it means that those government positions don't become permanent. People don't get in those jobs and then stay there for 10, 15, 20 years. It means that there's going to be more rotation in office. There's going to be more change. People will know that those jobs, it's not for life. They have to do a good job or they could get removed and so forth and so on. So he would say it means that there's more changing happening. There's more fresh ideas. Those jobs are not becoming hereditary permanent things, and the government is, kind of always evolving. He would also argue that means that you get more people serving in the government. More people have that opportunity of government service if you are more regularly changing out those positions. So not only does it mean fresh ideas, but it also means that more individuals are going to have that opportunity to be in government service, and people that might not have had that opportunity otherwise. So again, arguing that it's more inclusive. And someone like Jackson, he could also argue that what kind of people is he likely going to be appointing to those kind of jobs? It's going to be more of a common man thing, and it's a way of making it more inclusive and being more open to different people, and making this more of a people's democracy that is truly run by the people and not one that is run by a handful of wealthy elites. So the school system, yes, it absolutely has its downsides, and we'll see a lot more on that later on, where it really starts to come under attack for being used abusively. But Jackson portrays it as being a much more democratic way of getting things done, and a more democratic way of including more people into the government services and offices. Another change that's taking place that is part of the concept of Jacksonian democracy that is making it more inclusive instead of exclusive is there's changes that are taking place in the election process, or what that ought to say is probably the nomination process, not so much elections, but how candidates are nominated for elections, for president and really for any office you can think of. In that political parties by this time are starting to adopt and starting to use nominating conventions. They're starting to have nominating conventions to nominate their candidates for president, or it could be for state governor, whatever the case may be, but starting to have nominating conventions. And essentially what that means, the parties still have nominating conventions today. They're less, the thing that does, or what that meant in this time, was it meant you're including more people in that process. A nominating convention involves a whole lot more people, and you're opening that decision of who's going to be our candidate up to hundreds, maybe even thousands of individuals, instead of before that may have been literally less than 10 people that met in a closed, smoke-filled room somewhere and decided who the candidate was going to be. Who the political party was going to run for their office, for president or whatever, that was a decision of just a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people. The public had little to nothing to do with it. And the beginning of nominating conventions means that you are including a lot more people in that process. So it is, again, about giving the people more of a voice and more of a say-so in what was happening, more control over political party candidates. Now, obviously, again, all this is still quite limited. This is still a white man's democracy, no doubt about that, but it is moving a little bit in a different direction. And the idea for some, the more conservative, people would have argued, and Adams people, when Jackson is sworn in, they truly believe this is an end of America as they know it. The fact that someone like Jackson could be president was to them a very foreboding sign, and they just kind of waited for everything to fall apart. They saw his nomination, his victory, as the end of the country. Jackson, as I said, is not just a different kind of a president in the way that his background worked and kind of who he claims to represent. He's a different kind of president in his leadership as well. Jackson's presidency, like several others, it's kind of one of those notable moments where you have sort of, just changes in the office itself. And it's a major expansion of presidential power throughout Jackson's presidency. Jackson ultimately believes that the president ought to be a leader, and that the president had the authority to make his own decisions. He was not just an instrument of Congress. He was not just a tool to do whatever Congress told him to do, or to do whatever the courts told him to do. believed that he had the authority to make decisions as he saw fit, that the president was the one who got to decide A, B, and C. And so Jackson is quite the controversial figure, to farmers and to all those common man kind of folks. Jackson probably represented a great hero, someone that they looked up to and felt was fighting for them. But there are also plenty of people that saw Jackson as an absolute tyrant, as behaving unconstitutionally, and some that saw him probably as the absolute devil. And some of those, probably a lot of different groups, including most likely Native Americans. So we're going to look at today and tomorrow 3 kind of major crises or major problems that Jackson deals with in his presidency and he serves 2 terms. And what we're gonna do is kind of first start by just framing the problem, framing what the issue was, before we look at how evaluate how we think Jackson should have responded to it, and then looking at how he actually did respond to it. So the first issue we're going to look at has to do with Native Americans and the eventual removal of Native Americans. This is the one that you probably have the most background in and probably already know a good bit about, or can make assumptions about a lot of it. However, we're going to look at it a bit more specifically. There's probably some misconceptions about all of this. So let's frame this so-called Indian problem as it would have been framed back in the 1830s when this is going on. First of all, the Native Americans that we are talking about, the Native Americans that were in question at this particular time, are those in the southeastern United States. Where is the southeastern United States? Go a little bit more east. Like here, okay, we're talking about right here. Talking about Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, parts of North Carolina, all of that. That's the southeast. The Native Americans in this area were known as the 5 civilized tribes. Why do you think people called them that? What do you think they were trying to say about them? Okay, the relationship with them had, for the most part, been pretty good. They what now? Yes. And these tribes, 5 civilized tribes, by the way, anybody guess what they are? Cherokee's one. Creeks were the ones mostly in Alabama. Seminole in Florida. Remember them too? Choctaws and Chickasaws. Creeks are probably the ones most familiar in Cherokee, because Creeks and Cherokees were the ones in Alabama and Georgia, so they were the ones closest to us. These were known as the 5 civilized tribes because there were programs going back to the Washington administration that we didn't talk about to try to encourage, maybe that's not strong enough of a word, but encourage these Native Americans to adopt a lot of white American ways of life, encouraging them to become farmers, encouraging them to speak English, to practice Christianity, to dress like, white people, and a lot of them had. So they were considered civilized because a lot of them had, in a lot of ways, assimilated, which means to absorb, white American culture. So these were Native Americans, many of them which practiced some form, maybe not private land ownership, but they were farmers. Many of them, even a few that owned large plantations, some that actually owned slaves, most of which spoke English, many of which practiced Christianity. It's interesting, a lot of times when students start looking at, if they're looking at documents and stuff like that, are surprised when these Cherokee leaders and Creek leaders have English-sounding names. They are named John and William and all this stuff, but they're full-blooded, Native American, and still practice Native American culture to an extent. But those assimilation programs had worked reasonably well, I guess you could say, in the eyes of a lot of people, and the relationship had generally been pretty good. And the setup, the way this worked, the understanding that the United States government had with these Native American nations, the way they had always worked with them, the way they had always approached things, the understanding was their relationship was one of government to government. The United States approached Native American tribes in a similar way that they did foreign nations. And there were existing treaties with all these Native American tribes, the Cherokee, the Creeks, and others, that basically said this land in Alabama, like exactly where we are right now, that belongs to the Creeks. That is part of the Creek Nation. And therefore, Alabama laws do not apply on that for Native Americans because they are, to an extent, sovereign. And the same be true of Cherokee lands, and Georgia doesn't make laws for them, and it does not extend. That had been the way it had worked, and for a long time that worked pretty well. But things are changing by the time you get to the 1830s, and that this land, where all these Native Americans are, Creek lands and Cherokee lands and all those things, those are now becoming attractive to white settlers. And they are wanting to gain those lands, and they are starting to move onto those lands and to encroach upon Native American lands. Mainly because this is all happening when cotton production is starting to pick up, and so that land was becoming attractive, more attractive to white settlers that wanted to cultivate cotton and other things on that land. So what we have, this Indian problem, is you've got basically, white Americans that are creeping onto Native American lands, trying to settle on Native American lands, and what is that causing? It's causing disputes and fighting. So we've got fighting and disputes going on between Native Americans that are saying, hey, this land belongs to us. We have treaties with the United States government that says it belongs to us. You need to get off. But of course, nothing's being done about that. And in what also, and this is where, again, the whole, it gets more complicated than a lot of people think it is, but what's also happening is that states, for example, the state of Georgia, they're trying to extend their laws over those Native Americans. So not only are people trying to move on to the land, but the states are trying to extend their laws over Native Americans and essentially trying to govern them. And if they're doing that, basically what they're doing is they are creating laws that are not going to be very friendly to Native Americans. It's not just by saying, okay, you have to follow our laws now. Those laws are not helpful for Native Americans. Basically trying to create a situation, really and truly their motive was to create a situation where Native Americans would feel pressured to leave, so that they would feel like they weren't welcome, they couldn't stay there, and they would eventually leave. So we have this fighting taking place between settlers and between Native Americans, and states like Alabama and states like Georgia that are, in trying to enforce their laws discriminatory against Native Americans, against them, and questions about what the federal government should do about it, if anything. So Native Americans, one of the ways they respond, particularly the Cherokee respond by filing lawsuits, for one thing. Yes. They kind of say, oh, you want us to be civilized. Okay, well, you want us to be like you. We can do that. So they get a lawyer and sue. And their argument is, all of this, one, just their land. Of course they're arguing, and these are both cases involving the Cherokee versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. These are both cases the Supreme Court looked at. They are basically the same case. We're not going into specifics here. They're basically the same case, but one of them was filed by the Cherokee Nation and one was filed by a white American, Worcester. Anyway, Native Americans, are arguing not only does this land belong to them and that they have existing treaties with the United States government that says so, but they're also arguing, Georgia has no authority over us. These existing treaties say that we control our own fate, we control our own destiny, we make our own laws, that Georgia law does not apply to us. Basically asking, the Supreme Court to say, you gotta obey, telling the federal government, you gotta obey the treaty, you have to obey the law that you've already made with these people. And the interesting thing about both of these cases, really more Worcester than Cherokee, but the Supreme Court actually rules in the Cherokee's favor, okay? So the Supreme Court actually rules that Georgia cannot extend their laws over Native American nations. They can't do that. And I mentioned these are actually the same case. The reason it's the same case, Cherokee versus Georgia, the Supreme Court actually throws out, says we can't hear this case because the Cherokee are not citizens of the United States. You can't sue. Which in a way, though, that's kind of a victory for the Cherokee. That's exactly what they were saying. They were saying, we're not part of the United States. You can't tell us what to do. So Worcester was basically the same case filed by an American on their behalf. And that time they ruled, though, in the Cherokee's favor. So they ruled in their favor and basically said the land belongs to them. Treaty says all this stuff can't happen. However, The Supreme Court merely interprets the law. Whose job is it to enforce it? President. What do you think Jackson's going to say? He's not going to do it. Supposedly, he makes a statement where he says, Justice Marshall, referring to John Marshall, has made his decision, but let's watch him enforce it. Basically saying he's not going to do it. Jackson proposes this. Here's the stance Jackson takes. Jackson kind of says, I can't force Georgia to do anything. I can't make Georgia leave you alone. I can't enforce this treaty. I'm just the president. I can't do that. Georgia's a sovereign state. So ultimately, here's the thing. All these conflicts we're going to look at, they ultimately, in some way or another, involve a dispute between state government and federal government. It doesn't seem like that at the beginning, but it is. You have the state trying to do something. You have federal law, treaties with Native Americans that say something else. And a question of which one wins out and which one is Jackson going to support. Jackson here says, I can't make Georgia do anything. Their, state can do what they want to. I don't have authority over that. The federal government can't tell them what to do. So here's what I offer you instead. So that is the basis for this proposal, part of the story that becomes more familiar to you probably, the Indian Removal Act. So Congress proposes as a solution to this problem, the Indian Removal Act, which is often misunderstood. Sometimes we tend to think this just says all the Native Americans have to leave. That's not exactly what it says. Basically what this does is it authorizes the government to renegotiate with all of the Native American tribes, to basically say we throw out the old treaties and we're going to negotiate new ones. And this offers Native Americans, these Native American nations, a land exchange. So it offers them a land exchange. What does that mean? Basically, you give us your land, we sign a new treaty, you hand over your land in Alabama, you hand over your land in Georgia, all of that. We take that, and then what do Native Americans get? They get land somewhere else, okay? So it's you give us this, and we will give you land somewhere else, and we will relocate you. So it's offering to exchange land to relocate Native Americans. So according to this, the United States government, at its own expense, would pay for Native Americans to be relocated to a new place west of the Mississippi. That they would pay for them to get settled, provide them assistance for at least a year to get them on their feet so they can, start growing some crops and kind of get acclimated to their new environment, and you can preserve your culture and your way of life and keep on going as you are, and everybody's happy. So Jackson proposes this as sort of a compromise. I can't help you. I can't stop Georgia from being mean to you, but I can't enforce that treaty either. So here is the in-between, and everybody will be happy in the end. So that is the suggestion that is made. So now what we're going to do, we're going to come back to this in just a moment. What I want you to do next, though, is if you got your Chromebook, go ahead and get that out. Second. So we're not done with notes yet. We are going to come back to these. Okay, so if you're still got a sentence or two to write, that's fine. You can come back to it in a minute. But if you would please put Chromebooks and stuff aside for now, and let's look at what actually happened. So we're going to look at the end result of this, which probably isn't a mystery. I think most of us know how this all ended up. First of all, do you think Jackson is going to sign the Indian Removal Act? Of course, he was a big supporter of it. Huge supporter of the Indian Removal Act, made several speeches and stuff in support of it. So he does sign the Indian Removal Act, and that goes into effect. Now remember that the Indian Removal Act does not mean that Native Americans automatically have to leave. What it does is it authorizes the government to renegotiate treaties with them and draw up new treaties that call for that land exchange and all of that. So technically it is optional, but you must remember that for Native Americans, for many of them, it comes down to, if they stay, if they don't take the deal, and if they stay, what's going to happen? Their land's still going to be taken from them. They're going to be harassed. They're going to be attacked. Their laws are going to be, extended over them that are going to erase their culture and what race their way of life. So when we say that Native Americans in the end will all in some way, shape, or form take the deal and renegotiate treaties, it doesn't mean that they were all going, oh yay, we get to move now and they're going to pay for it. Ha ha ha, let's go do this. Many of them, it was, the only option they really had in order to preserve their culture at all and to not be totally destroyed. Also, many of these treaties, so over the next couple of years, treaties are going to be renegotiated that are going to relocate Native Americans from this area west of the Mississippi. Many of those were even fraudulent or were not done in a legitimate way. Oftentimes what happens, and this is always a problem that continues to happen, is that just because someone was a chief or a tribal leader, that did not necessarily mean they had the authority, or at least the way Native Americans saw it, they didn't have the authority to sign over all their land, on behalf of everybody else. In their minds, it just didn't work that way. So, the United States government would seek out someone that was willing to sign, maybe someone that even had a financial incentive to do so, but the rest of the tribe might not see that as legitimate. So some of them are fraudulent for a number of reasons. But in the end, treaties are eventually renegotiated with all Native Americans, the major Native American nations in these areas. And over the next several years after that, the relocations begin, and Native Americans are relocated out west of the Mississippi. Of course, as you know, that doesn't end up as nice and as neat and as pretty as the deal was kind of described, or as how Jackson and several others would have described it. And then you even continue to get resistance, particularly from the Cherokee. The Cherokee story is the most tragic, certainly, of all these Native American removals. The Cherokee were one of the Native American nations that even after a new treaty was reached, they refused to leave. They refused to leave their lands, mostly in Georgia, arguing that the treaty was illegitimate, saying that you negotiated this with people that had no authority to make such a decision for all of the tribe, and the land cannot just be handed over this way. And some of it is also a cultural difference. Native Americans just inherently viewed land differently, and they just didn't see ever land as something that you could just hand over, or that could just be taken. That was just beyond anything. It just didn't enter into their minds that it worked that way. So there's always just a cultural difference here. So when the Cherokee refused to leave, what happens? They are forced out. So this is when you get federal marshals going into Georgia, rounding up Cherokee, rounding up people, and forcing them to relocate. This, of course, is the infamous Trail of Tears that I'm sure you're familiar with. There are technically multiple Trails of Tears. Really, any of these relocations could be referred to as a Trail of Tears. However, the one that we typically think of, the one that's kind of the Trail of Tears, refers to the Cherokee. Because of that forced removal, where they are pretty much marched at gunpoint from Georgia to lands in what would later become Oklahoma. Thousands of Cherokee don't survive the journey, either dying of starvation, of disease. This was all done in the middle of winter without proper supplies. So many of them dying of exposure to the elements. And of course, just the incredible, devastating sadness of it all. To lose their lands and to lose their home and lose a lot of their culture. So they were rounded up, sometimes kept in sort of holding facilities for months, in type, actually Fort Mitchell, not too far from here, just down the road away, that was used as a rounding up point for both Cherokees and Creeks during this whole process. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So the end result is, of course, Native Americans being removed, some of them by force, to lands in, and we're not quite done yet. We're going to move on to the next problem. Some of them to places, what later be Oklahoma, Arkansas, and all of that. And the idea was, the wording in the Indian Removal Act was this was all forever. These would be their land forever. However, that will not be the case, as soon as that land becomes attractive to American settlement, they'll be the same thing will happen all over again. So when it came to, now as far as the dispute here between national government and state government, who here did Jackson seem to side with? State. Okay, here he kind of said, I can't force Georgia to do anything. I can't make the Supreme Court enforce the decision that was made. I can't enforce the treaties that were so on. I'm going to side, Georgia has the ability to do what they want to do in this particular case, but I offer you this as a compromise. This is what I can do. And the Indian Removal Act was that. So now we're going to look at another major crisis where we're going to see Jackson Act kind of take a little bit of a different tone when it came to the conflict between state government and federal government. So there's two crises we're going to look at in this section, one of which we're going to start today and then I get done with it, but we can at least get some of it. Something called the nullification crisis. So the first thing we're going to do before we frame this problem, we need to kind of go over the background about nullification once again. The first part of this is essentially review, and I don't think you will need to take too much notes on this first little part because the first couple of things, and I'll point out to you what they are things you've already taken notes on previously. We just need to bring it back up just to give us some context here to get the background of this. This has to do with so this part, so let me do this. Okay. So this has to do with that theory of nullification. Okay, this is something called the nullification crisis. We're going to start by looking at the legal reasoning and the background to this, starting with what the supporters of nullification, those people who are going to be in favor of nullification, that are going to be on the side of the particular state in question here, it's going to be South Carolina, where they got their idea from. Okay, all three of these things, Virginia, Kentucky resolutions, compact theory of government, theory of nullification. You've had those before. Those are all in chapter 6. So I do not think you need to write much down here. Just refer back to that to remember this argument. This is just to remind you where it came from. Remember Virginia, Kentucky resolutions, that was in response to, that was in the 1790s. You had Federalists that were making laws that were designed to hurt the Republicans. And so the Republicans fired back with these Virginia, Kentucky resolutions. One of the things they came up with in that Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was this compact theory. They argued what? That the states what? Yes, the states had more power because the states had what? Created the federal government. So the states had more power, and that brought them to this theory of nullification. And that was this theory that states had the authority to do what? To reject a law, to nullify a law, to say we're not going to do it. That it was the states that had the authority and perhaps even the duty to step in, and they could declare a law unconstitutional, not the Supreme Court, but the state could do that, and they could nullify it and basically say they're not going to enforce it. Then after that, remember I said it kind of got put on the shelf for a while. People sort of not really forgot about it, but really had no use for it. Maybe even decided it was a little bit too extreme, but that it would eventually get pulled back out. And here's that time where it's about to get pulled back out. In addition to those things and all of that stuff and pulling out and blowing the dust off the Virginia, Kentucky resolutions, this is different. This is new. Another thing that the supporters of nullification, those that are going to be in favor of nullification and will argue that states do have this authority and that this is legitimate and this is legal, another part that they will use for their legal reasoning for that was the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, if it's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, that makes it part of what? Makes this a part of the Bill of Rights. We didn't talk too much about it then. The 10th Amendment basically says that any powers that weren't granted to the federal government are reserved for who? The states, okay? Basically saying that any power they didn't give to the national government or the federal government are thereby reserved for the states. Sometimes this is known as the States' Rights Amendment, or becomes called that, certainly as a result of this. So they would use this amendment to make what argument? That states have all these other powers, to say that if the federal government was not explicitly given an authority in the Constitution, then the states automatically have those powers by default. So it's kind of a contradiction of the Supremacy Clause, really it is. So they would use this 10th Amendment to say, no, it's the states that have more power. The states have, kind of the blank check to do what they want. It stretches their power to do things and would include something perhaps like nullification. So that's going to be the side of those that will say yes to nullification. States do have this authority, and those that are going to bring it up. Let's take a look really quickly at those who are not going to support nullification. Those that will say nullification is not only is it not good, but that it's illegal, that states don't have that authority. Okay, so opponents of nullification, those that are going to say this is not legal and it's not legitimate, they're going to point to parts of the Constitution too to support their view. One of which is the Supremacy Clause. Remember that the Supremacy Clause, and this technically is review too. You had Supremacy Clause before. You should know what that says. It's in Chapter 5. Here we're just relating it to people that didn't support the idea of nullification. So Supremacy Clause says that what? Constitution is highest power, supreme law of the land. Therefore, the federal government is what? Supreme. And therefore, the states what? The states have to do what they say. Yeah, so this is the opposite of the 10th Amendment, saying that the national government is clearly over the states, and the states therefore could not, overrule them, and the states couldn't do anything that goes against that. So that one we talked about. Also, opponents of nullification, those that are going to say this is a bad idea and an illegal one, will point to the first 3 words of the Constitution to make their argument. The first 3 words being "we the people." And that might look a little weird. It's like, well, how in the world does that support their argument? Remember that the nullifiers are saying that the national government was created by who or what? By the states. They will say it wasn't the states that created it, it was the people. Okay? It wasn't the states that gave it its authority, it's the people that did. It's we the people create this Constitution, not we the states. So they would use that to argue it's not a creation of states. The states don't have some kind of special magical authority because they technically existed first. The authority in this country lies with the people, not with state governments. They don't have this kind of, this special sovereignty that these nullifiers tend to be talking about. The opponents of nullification, those that will be against it and say this is a bad idea, it's illegal, it's dangerous, they will also argue that the United States is a nation. We talked about that word a couple of times recently because it does mean something specific. What does it mean if you say the United States is a nation? It's united under one government. It's one thing, indivisible, that it cannot be broken up. And so therefore, an individual state cannot just decide that they're not going to do something. An individual state cannot just act differently than the rest. It's a nation. And the nation comes first, not state power. So they would again argue that that makes the national government supreme and makes it impossible for states to just sort of run around doing what they want. So those are some of the backgrounds going into this of what people think about nullification itself, whether or not it would be good, bad. The nullifiers would say this is just downright dangerous, and what kind of a country are we possibly going to have? What kind of country can survive if one part of it is allowed to just disobey or allowed to do things differently? So now let's take a look at, so what does this nullification crisis come from? What was the issue? Why did we get a state that said we're going to nullify something? Well, it has to do with tariffs. Recall that I mentioned that all these nationalistic policies in a way breed more sectionalism because they tend to help some areas of the country more than others. Remember also that tariffs were part of the American system. So in the years preceding this nullification crisis, tariffs had been going up in the country. And the South, just ingrain this into your brain, the South hates tariffs. They hate, despise tariffs, always. Because remember, those tariffs were really designed to help who? They help the North. Why do they help the North? Because they have all the industry, they have the factories. It was designed really to help them and protect their industries. Does the South have industries? No, they don't have that. They don't want it, And they don't have it, they don't want it. They're not really, even though they do benefit from it because they need their cottons in those industries, They don't really want to see it grow all that much, and they certainly don't favor an economic policy that helps the North and hurts them. All the South sees is higher prices, because tariffs do mean that prices go up. You did that thing on the American system, which illustrated that, or you kind of went through that. And if it raises the price of certain goods, then there may be less demand for their cotton. And so they see higher prices, and they worry that it will cause mainly Europe to stop buying a lot of their cotton. So they hate tariffs. Always will. That'll be one of their big arguments. So we know they don't like them. They will always hate tariffs. And then the situation gets further agitated by John C. Calhoun. We talked about John C. Calhoun once before. Do you remember what that was? He was a war hawk. Okay, originally he was a war hawk. Originally he was a big-time nationalist. Earlier on, he would have been supportive of things like the American system. However, he's from South Carolina, and he eventually starts to see that those policies did not help South Carolina. He started to see them as hurtful to South Carolina and hurtful to his part of the country. So although he started out as a nationalist, he does a big 180, and by this point is one of the biggest supporters, and continues to be until his death in 1850, one of the biggest supporters of states' rights. So he does a complete reversal, and by this point is very supportive of defending South Carolina and defending states' rights and against these tariffs. He publishes a document anonymously called the Exposition and Protest, and it is basically just railing against the tariffs and saying, shame on the tariffs and shame on the government for passing tariffs, and going through all those things we just discussed about why tariffs were so bad for the South, but arguing that this was going to completely destroy the South. That this was not just hey, we're irritated, we don't like high prices. He is arguing that this is going to mean the complete and total destruction of the South's economy, that they will cease to exist if these tariffs continue, and that it's just devastating for them. Basically arguing that tariffs will make slavery too expensive and they won't be able to afford it, and then their whole economy collapses. But, suggesting that this was not just an irritation to South Carolina, that this could destroy them. And then he starts bringing up the whole nullification thing. This is where he starts blowing the dust off of that and starts talking about nullification and suggesting that that might be an option here, and suggesting that this would be a time where that would be warranted, because it's not always an issue of whether or not something is constitutional, but he's saying that it can be done if it's just harmful, because tariffs are not unconstitutional. It's a tax, and Congress has the power to tax. But he's saying that if it's harmful, that a state could nullify it. He's saying this is harmful, this will destroy South Carolina, so we'd be within our rights to nullify it. And he goes even a little bit further than that. So he says states can nullify even if it's harmful. So he's kind of taking the stuff that was already put out there in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and he starts building on it. And he argues that he kind of comes up with a procedure for how you would do it, like how a state would actually go about nullifying. So you call a convention, you nullify it. And then he suggests, if the federal government does not accept that nullification, if they don't agree, or if they don't say, okay, fine, then the state would have the right of secession. So he suggests secession if it doesn't work, basically. Now, what does that mean again, to secede? To leave the country. He says, then we have the right to leave the country and withdraw to protect ourselves if the federal government does not accept that. Well, he publishes all this stuff, publishes it anonymously, and it's kind of out there for a while because the tension continues to build. Some people are listening, some people think this is terrible. When then in 1832, a new tariff is passed that raises it even higher, and that is when South Carolina, being nudged along by John C. Calhoun, he's not, publicly leading it, but he's probably behind it, South Carolina calls together a convention and claims, at least, to have nullified the 1832 tariff. So what are they saying about that tariff? It doesn't apply to us. We're not going to do it. They're saying that they're not going to enforce it, that it is unconstitutional on the grounds that it's harmful to them, and they are not going to do it. So this is the nullification crisis that Jackson, as president, is faced with. Calhoun, by the way, is his vice president, which makes it a little bit more tense. So this is the situation he's faced with, okay? He has a state that is claiming to have nullified a tariff, that is saying they have the right to do that, this is harmful, and is also threatening to do what if he doesn't say, okay, fine. They're threatening to secede, threatening to leave if Jackson does not accept their nullification of this tariff, okay? So let's go back then very quickly to the document you had out. Open that back up real quick. You can put your notes aside.